want to believe. What do you say? Something is real and something is false. Tell me some lie and I feel well. What is true? It's really bad.
Mr. Lindsey?
No, call me Brink.
Okay. You are in Thailand, which is a little bit interesting.
I am
up there.
Well, it's a long story. I work at a think tank, the Niskanen Center, where I'm a vice president, but I'm working remotely here. In a former life, before I was in the think tank world, a long time ago, I was a lawyer doing international trade regulation, representing companies in East Asia, exporting to the United States, getting tripped up in regulatory problems. Worked up and down the Pacific Rim in Thailand more than anywhere, fell in love with the country way back then. That started a chain of circumstances, which led ultimately to me meeting my wife here in Thailand 9 years ago, getting married. We came to the United States, lived there for a while, for 5 years. But then I'd always wanted to spend time here. She had children from an earlier marriage, and so we wanted to spend part-time here and build a house here. Then the pandemic came and revealed that remote work was just absolutely A-okay as far as I was concerned. So we decided, what the heck, let's move here full time. So 2 years ago, we moved here to Roy Et. It's a metro area of about 300,000, about 300 miles northeast of Bangkok, my wife's hometown. And so I've taken the whole remote work trend to its geographical extreme.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. You know, these cities overseas will often have, you know, twice as many people as Cleveland, let's say, but I've never heard of it.
Yes.
So, you know, there are countless Chinese cities that, you know, are as big as a Dallas and a Houston put together, but they're not any of the ones we've heard of. They're not Shanghai.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in any case, yeah. So, so I wanted to contact you because, very roughly, and I can't say that I'm an expert on everything you've written, but I feel like you've been down a somewhat similar trajectory to me. And I'll just say real quick, you know, I back in the 2000s in my student seminar days, you know, I was very much involved with you know, libertarianism and the Mises Institute. I ran the gamut from the kind of Mises Institute, sort of a edgier or somewhat problematic classical liberal, to the kind of Cato Institute classical liberal. So that entire worldview has seemed to have been taken a beating in the last roughly 10 years, and primarily from the right. I think they sort of lob criticisms at the classical liberals, such as they are far too economistic in their thinking. They have a kind of transactional anthropology, to use a term I read or I learned from James Poulos, is an interesting thinker. Just, I guess, at a kind of high level, why do you think the kind of classical liberal idea has come in for such criticism, especially in the last 10 years or so?
So just by way of background, I spent the bulk of my career as a professional libertarian working at the Cato Institute. I was directed their trade policy operations for a while, and then I was a vice president for a number of years. I, like many people, got turned on to libertarianism by reading Ayn Rand when I was a teenager. This was back in the 70s when everything seemed to be falling apart. And so I was very receptive for a message, for that message. And I would say, you know, and so I worked at a libertarian think tank for 20 plus years. Over the course of the 21st century, my libertarianism weakened and ultimately kind of fell away. There's still a whole lot of libertarian principles I hold very strongly to, but the overall body of thought is one I no longer identify myself with, and let me explain. I think that body of thought is in possession of important partial truths that private enterprise and market competition are immensely important social technologies for economic and technological and social progress. That centralized power is always dangerous, even when useful, and can go very badly wrong. There's all kinds of problems with trying to do things from the top down that because of incentive problems and information problems, even if you have the best intentions, you can end up messing things up very badly. All of these ideas are important. And I would say at the time the libertarian movement kind of took off in the 60s and 70s, those ideas were very much underrated and underappreciated. At that time, we had about 1/3 of the world living under Marxist-Leninist regimes that were dedicated to the proposition that private property and markets had no place whatsoever in economic life. The advanced countries had all seen huge expansions in government control over the economy over the past couple of decades. And so at that time, and there were a gathering series of problems, especially stagflation in the 70s. So that was a propitious time, I think, for pushback from the libertarian side and for corrections of many of the excesses and mistakes that had been made during the social democratic era. I would say, though, that those are partial truths. They're not the full truth. I no longer think that a modern high-tech society can run with minimal government. I think there are simply too many collective action problems that require government solutions. Those government solutions are hard to effect and very difficult to get right, but that doesn't mean that not trying them is the best way. So I've changed my mind over that over the course of the 21st century. Basically, what happened was I think that the partial truths of libertarianism, the overlap between those partial truths and the challenges of the day sort of diminished over the 21st century. We started seeing big problems like the reemergence of a class divide now along educational lines that isn't susceptible. It doesn't go away just because incomes go up. In fact, it's got deeper. We've seen climate change, which is a gigantic collective action problem that markets alone cannot solve. We had a huge pandemic, which reveals the limits of purely voluntary action in a big way. So I think that the purchase that libertarian ideas have on solving problems in the here and now has weakened considerably in the 21st century. When that happens, when ideologues can't be practical, they double down on ideology, and so I think we've seen as libertarian influence on the Republican Party kind of ran out of gas, it just turned into nothing but tax cutting for rich people. The last big attempt to reform the welfare state to partially privatize Social Security under the Bush administration just completely collapsed because it was incredibly unpopular. And so since that time, since the ability to actually make incremental pro-market reforms has kind of been exhausted by the Republican side, they just sort of switch gears into political theater and being theatrically anti-government, and that the public sector is the source of everything bad, and the government can't do anything correct. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as you appoint hacks to run various government agencies, and then of course they screw up, and that's evidence that the government can't do anything. So I think that the libertarian influence on the Republican Party has become more and more just sort of theatrical culture war rather than any kind of pragmatic, attempt to make the world better, and has attracted that kind of, it has followed the trend of left and right as well. We're in this performative culture war phase of politics right now, which is very depressing and very non-substantive. And I think the organized libertarian movement has a whole lot of it. People who now call themselves libertarians are sort of indistinguishable from Trumpist populists. A whole lot of them. There's kind of professional libertarians in the think tank world, like Cato, who are still doing their thing. But I think the energy in the libertarian movement is now very different from what it was, and isn't a positive energy at all in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting. The attempt to fuse libertarianism with a kind of muscular nationalist Trumpism has been odd. It's almost as if they've sort of offset the diminishment of their enthusiasm for free trade by going whole hog deregulation, within the country, sort of domestically. They're sort of trying to average out to what they were before, and in a strange way, libertarianism is quite flexible in that way, because I think from a harder left or right perspective, libertarianism feels as if it looks as if it's kind of dodging the big questions by leaving it to, freely consenting individuals. So there's a weirdly ambidextrous and chameleon-like character to libertarianism.
Yeah, but I would say that there's libertarian-sounding rhetoric of this, smashing the deep state that's coming out of the MAGA Trumpist wing of the party. But I don't think it has the first thing to do with any kind of principled devotion to limited government. I see this much more as just a bid to overturn the whole civil service protections of 100 plus years, and go back to a spoil system of just corrupt appointment of political cronies to do the personal will of the boss, unconstrained by law. So this is a wolf in libertarian clothing. This smash the deep state stuff is, in my view, nothing but a gambit to degrade the rule of law and substitute personalistic rule for the rule of law, which is the only real guarantor of liberty in a modern society. So I don't think they're doubling down on part of the libertarianism. I think they're just using libertarian rhetoric for a deeply illiberal, authoritarian, anti-liberal movement.
Yeah, it's that's one ramification I hadn't really considered before. As far as smashing the deep state, you can break that down into different aspects of things we don't like, right? So kind of CIA and FBI machinations. That's all perfectly kind of civil libertarian. It has a left-wing component, obviously, but the right-wing libertarians, they've always kind of been there. But the idea of smashing the administrative state as a whole, the ramifications of that, well, it would be something more like machine politics, right? Instead of a kind of permanent bureaucracy, you have one that kind of is constantly churning based on the whims of those who are being appointed by a new administration all across, multiple institutions, right?
Yes. So, and
that does actually smack of machine politics, and yet,
right, and so the libertarian aversion to the surveillance state, that's well justified. But this flavor of authoritarian populism that uses libertarian language, it's not at all shy about using the coercive powers of the government. Trump was constantly trying to sic the IRS on political opponents, hold up mergers for people he didn't like. So I see again this populist movement that uses libertarian rhetoric has no legitimate limited government aspirations. It just wants to seize power for its gang and use it as unconstrained by law and by majority rule as possible.
Yeah. You can break down libertarianism into two, well, not terribly distinct wings, but there's always been more anti-government libertarian and then the pro-market libertarian.
Yes.
Pro-market libertarians are on the back foot now because just the thorough politicization of everything now better comports with this interest in government power, rather than the sort of often unforeseen ways that market liberalism can help people achieve their discrete, unique local ends or something. So yes. It feels as if politics is much more zero sum than it used to be. People are losing belief that markets can get people out of each other's faces. which of course is not the optimistic way of spinning it. Just a moment ago I put the optimistic or the more positive way of
Right.
that idea that people can pursue their ends in peaceful ways and all of that. And so this thorough politicization has turned the anti-government, or rather have put the anti-government libertarians in the driver's seat, and a lot of the kind of less obviously politically useful notions of how markets can help everyone thrive are now in a kind of defensive position, fortunately.
Yeah, the principled intellectual arguments for limited government are subtle and counterintuitive. The obvious thing is, if you want something to get better, you want to make a law and you want government to tell people to do it, or you want government to give people money to do it. Whereas the limited government free market way is the indirect way. You want to empower people to do things themselves. You want to set up rules so that they can coordinate spontaneously without central direction to do things better than any boss could direct from above. That's subtle, that's intellectual, that's counterintuitive. That to make that case requires the kind of politics that's serious, that's intellectually serious, where you can make arguments and advance evidence. The clown show that we have today, where everyone just calls each other's names and tries to demonize the other side as much as possible, and all of politics is not about what my side is going to do, but how awful the other side is if they get in power, and so we have to stop them at all costs. That is not an atmosphere in which there's any kind of possibility of intelligent limited government economic policy making. Just none.
Yeah. And but here's where it gets thorny. It sounds like you're sort of alluding to social media. That's kind of what we're thinking. This has been,
well, that's part of it, but it's much broader than that. But yes, that's part of it.
I was going to say that capitalism gave us social media.
Yes.
And so it's sort of capitalism is eating itself in a sense.
Yeah. So I'm running a Substack right now called The Permanent Problem, which is about this transition from mass material prosperity to actual mass flourishing. Right now we're rich, but we're not so happy. Where did the slip up happen? And in fact, if you look at capitalism not just as the markets, but as the whole system itself, capitalism is the market system. It's also the modern bureaucratic state, which provides the legal and public goods infrastructure within which markets take place. It's also the modern media system, also organized science. All of that is the current modern capitalist system, and it runs in one variant or another globally right now. So we've got advanced capitalism, we've got backward capitalism, we've got corrupt capitalism, we've got clean capitalism, we have democratic capitalism, we have authoritarian capitalism, but we've got capitalism everywhere. And it has accomplished amazing things. So we're just, in the past 30 years, we've seen a drop in global severe poverty, unlike anything that's ever occurred in human experience. This has been the best generation for Homo sapiens since we started things up a couple 100,000 years ago. So capitalism is capable of generating enormous, resources and powers. The question is then how are we able to make use of those resources and powers to live well? And in some cases, it seems that capitalism creates kind of cultural responses that to our material prosperity, which end up being perverse and which end up leading us kind of in the wrong direction. So for one example, once we get rich, when people get rich, they want to hang on to the stuff they have. And they focus very much on holding on to their own, to what they've got, even to the exclusion of other bigger gains that they might forego. So there's a general conservatism that clicks in when people accumulate. And we've seen that in the rich world, starting in the 70s when mass prosperity became the norm in America and Western Europe. We called ourselves developed countries, like we're done. We started passing all these zoning laws to make it extremely difficult to build anything new, started passing historic preservation laws to make it difficult to do anything new, exploded these lobbying coalitions in government that tried to preserve the status quo when it was advantageous. So a whole lot of kind of cultural responses to growing rich and fat and happy and lazy have undermined our dynamism. I think we see the kind of unchecked glorification of personal choice to the exclusion of any higher values is a cultural trend that has grown out of our prosperity, and it has been influenced by both the left and the right. Of course, from the commercial right, we're told constantly to do whatever we want, spend our money on whatever we want. We're individuals. We can define ourselves, and we can have it our way. We can break all the rules. We can. Meanwhile, on the cultural side, we have this expressive individualism that you need to find your authentic identity and be the real you, and you can't let anybody else hold you back, and you can't let any oppression of the past hold you back. So we have this culture that's very anti-authoritarian, and that ends up ultimately kind of acting as an acid bath and causing people to disconnect from work. We have falling labor force participation. We have disconnection from family, lower marriage rates, plummeting childbirth rates, disconnection from community, much less involvement in community organizations in the past. Now, if you're involved, it's just writing a check, and then declining trust in social institutions and this poisonous polarization in politics. So the bonds which hold society together are kind of coming unglued under this kind of cultural acid. So yes, I would say on the dynamism side and on the inclusion side that there are consequences of capitalism's success, which are causing problems, which just goes to show you there's no end to the story. Solution, nothing fails like success. Solve one problem, it will create new problems, and that's what we're in the middle of now. We solved the problem of being, in the shadow of physical privation. That was the problem that humanity was, problem number one for humanity since the get-go. We've pretty much solved that, but now we have a host of new problems that we're floundering with.
Yeah, I think the farther we get away from the Cold War, the farther we get away from communism as any kind of realistic, viable alternative, the more we have to sort of contend with capitalism, or problems specific to capitalism.
Yes. Which
for the longest time we could just say, hey, well, at least we're not starving. Well, hey, at least we're not standing in bread lines or, reduced to one terrible brand of television set. That's
yes, correct.
Just not really hitting home like it used to.
No, and it's also perversely, I think the collapse of communism is an important contributor to our messed up politics. There was a real constraint on internal political feuding when you've got an existential threat pointing 10,000 nuclear warheads at you. But once that threat was gone, it became politically convenient to make the other side the existential threat. And so I think it's noteworthy that the last time we had a president who won an election and the other side just, universally acknowledged, even though they didn't vote for him, they universally acknowledged he won, was George H.W. Bush in 1988, the last Cold War president. 1992, Clinton won. The Republicans didn't really think he was legitimate. There was the whole Perot weirdness, plus Whitewater and Jennifer Flowers. They were constantly trying to oust him. They never thought he was a legitimate president. Bush in 2000, of course, the crazy election meant that Democrats never really thought he was legitimate. Then Obama, of course, there was a huge, birth certificate flap and that whole crazy conspiracy theory, and a big chunk of the Republicans never thought he was the real president. Then Trump came in, and of course, the Democrats thought the Russians had put him in, and he wasn't a legitimate president. So we've had a real breakdown in internal cohesion because of the absence of an external enemy, which is depressing, that you need something bad in the world to hold some good things in place, but sometimes that's how things work.
I wonder if it's mainly that, or it's essentially a greater understanding of how we are different. We have, a proliferation of media, proliferation of viewpoints. In other words, even if the Cold War had continued, if media trends had gone the direction they've been going, we just would have learned how different we really are.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so we see right now what I would say in the United States and in Europe is a legitimacy crisis for liberal democracy. That there is widespread disaffection and disillusionment and lack of faith in established institutions and governing elites. And why is that? So part of it is because elites have screwed up a lot. We had the Iraq War, we had the global financial crisis, we had 10 years of stagnation after it. So we had a lot to make people get people out of sorts and upset with the government. But I think an equally important part is that the screw-ups of government are much, much more visible today, and it's much easier for people to organize their discontent through social media than it was in the past. I mean, you just look back and think about FDR was a paraplegic, and the vast majority of Americans did not know it. JFK, ran around just promiscuously, extravagantly promiscuously, and nobody knew it. The ability to keep for the official story to be carefully curated by the establishment was an important way in which political coherence was achieved and political consensus was manufactured. There was a shortage of information, and the people at the top were kind of in control of how it flowed. Now we have information superabundance and information anarchy, and everybody can reach a global audience if they go viral. And so that is a much less congenial environment for top-down control.
Yeah, that reminds me of that the book by Martin Gurry, The Revolt of the
Yes.
I'm getting it confused with the book title that he was riffing on, the original, but the Revolt of
the Revolt of the Public is his
right,
book.
right. Yes, the original was Revolt of the Elites.
Yeah, Revolt of the Masses was the original.
This kind of new media-driven populism, it can kind of keep a gaze on its target for so long that any opportunity to, kind of get around them through some kind of okay, so let's say someone's been voted into office on a populist mandate, and they need to actually govern, and that means dealing with people who disagree with them in a parliament. Well, they can keep the populist-driven media can keep the gaze on them such that they fear ever deviating from what their audience wants.
Yes. Yeah, but these publics that are summoned by the new media environment are different from the old publics of the print age. Those publics, you had mass national organizations, labor unions, and chambers of commerce, and many others that were built from local chapters where people locally participated and then aggregated up to national hierarchies. So people were actually personally involved in the organizing and the grunt work of politics. Today, politics is overwhelmingly elite driven. It's run by well-educated college grads working for nonprofits and activist groups and for interest groups. The mass public only supports these activities through checks, and so the ability of the public to influence things is much less rooted in organization. It's just flightier and more ephemeral. It's easy to get a mob together on Twitter, and they can say no, or they can say to whoever the hate object of the day is, "We hate you," and they can make life miserable. But they can't manufacture consent. They can't pull together people who disagree with each other and get them to agree on half a loaf and push it doggedly until it's over the finish line. It's a very lazy, instantaneous kind of political participation, which really is only effective at saying no and for throwing sand in the gears, not for actually accomplishing anything.